Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Pizza 101. Today, we will talk about my favorite topic, all time favorite topic, which is dry preferments for pizza napoletana. Okay? And who am I to tell you about this? My name is Stefan. I have a master degree in process engineering with the focus on biochemistry and fermentation processes. And I'm the owner of Gemello, a pizzeria in Berlin. So I know quite a few things about pizza, especially high throughput pizza making in the for pizzerias. And today I want to explain or I want to show you a nice application for a preferment for high dough volumes. That's very easy and practical for pizzerias, for a pizzeria workflow. And in order for you, before we start with this, or for you, in order to understand better, I always like to explain or show you the two big kind of dry preferments, the two extremes, because the truth or the best solution is mostly in the middle. Um, so let's have a look at those two preferments. So on the left side, we have the classic Biga. Everybody knows the Biga. It got famous through Roberto Susta or Vincenzo Capuano made it mainstream. The pizza canotto, the pizza with the big puffy crust. Canotto means actually a rest security boat. You know what I mean? Um, it's basically the renaissance of Napolitan style pizza with the big puffy crust. They pushed it to extremes. And the classic Biga has a very, in general, a low hydration of around 45% and a high yeast level. Okay. On the other hand, we have I call it sponge now, which has more a higher hydration. It's almost like a dough with 60% hydration. So 600 grams water per kilogram of flour, but it has a relatively low yeast level. Let's have a look at those two and compare them. And I will explain you the differences, the advantages, and the downsides. And after we understood both of those extremes, both of these pre-doughs, we will have a look at, in my opinion, a better solution for you. Okay, an easier solution. So first of all, what is a biga actually? A biga is a dry brie-ferment that is used as a starter for your main dough. Okay, there are basically three kinds of preferments, dry preferments, like what we will talk about today. There's also wet or liquid preferments, like the poolish, which has a hydration of 100% normally, and it gives more a soury or more like a sourdough vibe to your main dough. The biga or the dry preferments give you more like a buttery, nutty um, flavor profile, so to say. There's also a third type, which is sourdough, but actually it's not really a preferment because it's more like a yeast. Because a poolish and a biga are preferments, but you use yeast to ferment them. Okay? And then only you take the biga and put them in the main dough as your starter. So let's go back and have a look at the biga. Um, like I said, the Biga has a very low or relatively low hydration of 45%. The number, you see it already on the number, it's a bit hard to calculate. It's a bit tricky. 1% fresh yeast, which means 10 grams of yeast per kilogram of flour. And we have a relatively high fermentation temperature of 18 degrees for 16 hours. And the Biga it got famous through Roberto Susta with the so-called no stress technique. This is the technique how you produce it basically. If you want to have a closer look, just search on YouTube Biga no stress Roberto Susta, and you will find it. It's basically you bring together flour, water, and yeast with your hands very loosely, and it looks almost like this, like dough strings kind of. And the idea behind this technique is we want to minimize gluten development. Why we want to minimize gluten development? Because then we can put a lot of yeast into our biga for strong fermentation and flavor profile, but at the same time, we minimize the leavening, the rise of the dough, which makes your dough normally very elastic and gives a very chewy consistency in your final pizza crust. We want to avoid that, okay? Um, so the advantage, or let's have a look at, sometimes it's not sometimes an advantage is also a disadvantage. So let's have a look at the different properties of a classic biga. So as I said already, it has a very strong aroma, which sounds good at the beginning. But for example, if you make gourmet style pizza with a lot of different dominant flavor toppings, I would not recommend this kind of preferment. Or I would recommend it, but then at a low percentage in your main dough. For example, a 20 or 30% biga dough. That means 20% of the flour, of the total flour weight, is used for your biga. A big advantage, as you can see, the fermentation temperature is 18 degrees. That means we don't need a fridge, basically. We don't need a fridge. That's a big advantage because you can save space. But where to find 18 degrees? 18 degrees is a typical fermentation, or like a typical temperature to store red wine, for example. I saw people storing bigas in small batches in wine fridges, which is perfect, but probably not the best solution if you have a pizzeria and have a big biga, for example. I also heard about fermentation chambers for reptile eggs because they also are 18 degrees Celsius. But you can also, if you make small batches, you can go with your temperature gun through your apartment, and normally you can find like a dark corner in your kitchen is around 18 degrees, or a basement. A basement is very good to store a biga, but if you make a biga for your pizzeria with 25 kilograms, so for 150 dough balls, more or less, you don't want to run to the basement and transport the biga up and down all the time. So it's also not practical. Um, we talked about the strong aroma, that it's bad for a gourmet style pizza, but at the same time, it's good for more simplistic pizzas, like very classic pizzas like margarita or marinara, where really the single ingredients stand out and are the star of the show. Then you can actually make a high percentage classic biga dough, because then you really can taste the biga. It's not an overload for your palate. Um, Disadvantage of a classic biga is you need malt. Malt is a form of sugar that can be processed by the yeast immediately without splitting it down, without breaking it down before by the enzymes. The problem is malt is a very expensive ingredient, so you want to avoid that for your pizzeria workflow. Um, yeah, but that's the properties more or less for a classic biga. Now, let's have a look at the so-called sponge. The sponge is a more modern version um, of the classic biga. It got more famous by pizzaioli like Vincenzo Abate. And you can see it has a hydration of around 60%, has a way lower yeast percentage, and it's made in the machine almost until the pumpkin forms. So you have gluten development, but not maximum gluten development. So that means you have already a little rice in the dough, usually, but that gets compensated by the lower yeast percent. So you don't have so much rice. So a sponge you could actually describe more as a autolyse with a little bit of yeast. Okay? And a sponge is typically completely cold fermenters. So you make the sponge, you put it directly into the fridge, and after 24 hours, so longer than the Biga, um, it is ready. So what are the properties of this sponge? So first of all, you have a way milder flavor profile, which is now suitable for gourmet pizzas. You have a lot of dominant flavored toppings on gourmet pizzas, so then you don't want to have a crazy tasty dough. You want to have a more mild dough. Okay, so this is very suitable for these kind of pizzas. Um, Now, a big advantage of using a sponge is the low starting temperature when you make your main dough, because you ferment your sponge at 5 degrees in the fridge, but due to the fermentation activity, the sponge comes out of the fridge more or less with, I would say, 8 to 10 degrees. So you start with this temperature, and you don't have to use ice water when you make the main dough. And this is a game changer, especially in summer season. So you start with a low starting temperature with your main dough. Very important. This dough is also suitable for very high pre-ferment percentages in your main dough, up to 100%. But, or not but, for this kind of dough, you have to use a lot of refresh yeast. Refresh yeast is the second part of yeast you put into your main dough. So for the Biga, the yeast in the Biga is higher than in the main dough, higher than the refresh yeast, and in the sponge it's the other way around. You have more refresh yeast than yeast in the sponge. And the effect, what this has is that you put all the fermentation drive into your dough balls and not basically in the bulk fermentation. And that leads to a very airy, puffy crust. But when you make the dough balls normally run flat quickly because there was no gas development in your pre-dough. And the gas normally gives stability to your dough. And if you don't have this stability, then your dough balls run flat. The difference in the Biga, for example, you have a high fermentation power, and as soon as you make your dough, when you finish with the dough kneading, the yeast was already very active in the Biga and produced carbon dioxide, which puts a lot of air or gas into your dough. You can visualize it like million of little gas balloons that get deflated by the yeast with the carbon dioxide, and this gives stability to your dough, and that makes your dough balls basically more puffy, so they puff more up during the ball fermentation. And like I said, with the sponge, with the dough made with the sponge, the dough balls normally flatten out, so it's very tricky to work with it. Okay, so these are the two extremes. We have the Biga on one side, the very active one, and we have the more mild and more autolyse style pre-ferment, which is the sponge on the other hand. These are the two extremes. Now, now I want to introduce the way I do it, or I would recommend it to you for hobby pizza chefs, but mainly for pizzeria workflows if you have a pizzeria. And this is we call it the preferment. Okay, it got really famous as a preferment. For example, Vincenzo Capuano is using this, and yeah, let's have a look at this preferment. You can see the hydration is 50%. What do you see here when I tell you the hydration is 50%? Exactly. It's super practical and easy to calculate. A Biga with 44 or 45% to calculate is a pain in the ass. So why not just using 50%? 10 kilo flour, 5 kilo water. Super easy. Just the half of the flour weight is water. Easy to calculate. And if you have a pizzeria and you have employees, you want to make it as easy as possible for them. I had so many cases on Sunday morning where pizza chefs called me and said they made mistakes by calculating the dough, and I had to run on Sunday morning to the pizzeria and manage it again. So you want to avoid it when you have a pizzeria. So the yeast percentage is around 0.3 until 0.5. I also gave you a range for the sponge, and this varies, of course, depending on the dough size. If you have a bigger dough, you use relatively less yeast. Or, for example, if it's summer season, you also use a little bit less yeast. That's why I gave you here a range, okay? Because if you make a preferment with 1 kilogram of flour and put it in the fridge, and if you make a preferment with 25 kilogram of flour and put it in the fridge, the smaller preferment cools down quicker, and you compensate that with more yeast. Makes sense, right? So this preferment is made on reverse mode in the machine. So it's also something in between Biga with minimal gluten development and sponge with a little bit gluten development. So the preferment is somewhere in between those two, okay? And now, very, very cool thing about this preferment is you ferment it at 2 temperatures. It's also a disadvantage, but also you can use it as your advantage. For example, I wrote here 2 to 6 hours at room temperature and the rest in the fridge, cold temperature. So 24 hours in total. And now, by the amount of time or by the ratio between the fermentation at room temperature and the fermentation at cold temperature, you can basically personalize your individual flavor profile, because the longer it stays out at room temperature, the more complex flavor it develops, and the less fermentation at room temperature, the more mild it gets, the more in the direction of a sponge it becomes. So you can actually manage by yourself how you want it. So this preferment is a hybrid between the Biga and the sponge, and it combines the disadvantages and the advantages of both. As I said, it's easy to calculate. And yeah, on the right side here, you can see, for example, this is a preferment made with 20 kilograms of strong flour. You want to use a strong flour of W300, 330 for these kinds of dry preferments. And under this photo, you can see like the fermentation time split in at room temperature and in the fridge, and how it affects the flavor. Okay, guys, this is it with this video. If you have some questions or comments, just put it down in the comments here. I promise you I answer every single comment. Okay, please ask me super nerdy questions. Check also out my pizzeria and the way I make the dough in my pizzeria. You find also the link to Instagram here in the description box. And yeah, guys, that's it. Have fun with experimenting and use this kind of preferment, and let me know how it turns out. Actually, I'm really curious. See you next time in the next video. Have a nice evening. Have a nice day wherever you are. And if you have more questions, if you tell me what you want to see in the next video, okay? Put it down in the comments. See you next time. Ciao.